I'm Vicky Pryce. I've come from London specifically for this. I'm delighted to have been asked by Professor Phelps to do so. He didn't know, and Lizzie, who's arranged my travel and everything else, didn't realize that I also have a son who's at Columbia. And the terrible thing about giving a talk in front of your son, who's here, is that children are your worst or best critics. So I really, was worried about this, and I still am. But what I should be really more worried about is all these great speeches that we've had so far. I don't have slides. I decided, even though I am a slide person, I am a person who uses slides quite a lot, not to use one today. I don't know why. It was mainly because I was changing my mind all the time, and I thought I would hear quite a lot of interesting things anyway this morning that might make me want to say something slightly different. Well, I will try and keep to a script of sorts, but what Lizzie would like me to do is at the end of this presentation to leave a little bit of time for questions. I don't know if we're going to manage this. I haven't seen any inclination of anyone wanting to ask questions so far, so it may just become a complete disaster. But nevertheless, I will try. But what I really want to talk about today is why gender inequality still persists under a capitalist economy and society, and the impact that this has on the economy and society. And this is, of course, despite the fact that we've seen a big rise in female labour participation in the last 50 years or so. That has been helped, of course, by the contraceptive pill and also leaps in female education. We were hearing a little bit about that before and how education has been such an important equaliser, if we want to call it that. And, of course, we've seen a welcome narrowing of the gap, as Andre himself had demonstrated earlier. But progress has recently stalled. Even in the best performing countries in terms of equality, and those tend to be the Scandinavian countries in Europe. And the World Economic Forum is saying very, very clearly, year after year now, that the path to gender equality is moving at a glacial pace, is what they say. And the IMF continues to do analysis which shows that if women were employed in the right positions and also getting the right pay, we would have seen very substantial improvements in welfare and in the economy across all regions. It's not just in the less developed ones where we know there are very substantial restrictions in terms of women's ability to work. So we would see a large improvement in GDP, and we know that charities and aid agencies highlight continuously the role in development, in having women's access to economic opportunities improve. Well, the real question is, what does capitalism have to do with ensuring that those gaps are eliminated? Because what we're seeing right now is that across the globe, women are still lagging behind across all equality indices, whether we look at politics, education, wealth, and of course economic empowerment. And the gap in pay is still there and is not going away. It's very stubbornly now stuck to where it is, and it is actually quite substantial, and I'll give you some figures later on that. Well, you would have thought that in a capitalist economy of the type we were talking about, even though, of course, in the mind of Thomas Piketty that we've just been hearing, this capitalist economy is changing into one which is including a lot more workers there, but if it did, then it would have perhaps made a bigger difference to women. But nevertheless, in a capitalist economy, you have supply and demand and prices operating in a way that should really be clearing the market. It should have eaten away, if you like, the differentials that exist in pay in particular, and that would have been completed quite some time ago because capitalism is new. But of course, it all depends what we mean about capitalism, and it is true, and it has been hinted already a number of times, that it can take many forms. I mean, what do we understand about capitalism in the US and how it operates is very different to that of China, which has a sort of socialist capitalism working. Or even, actually, much of Europe. There are huge differences in terms of the role of the state in countries in Europe. Again, Scandinavian countries, much bigger state. What you see in other places, not so much, but nevertheless, there are differences in terms of the ways that societies operate, the role of workers, mentioned by Thomas Piketty in Germany. And when I was doing my studies at the LSE in the 1970s, I took as one subject the economics of central planning. And I was rather surprised to see that the countries that were examined then were China, of course, and Russia and the former Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and France. So just thinking about Thomas Piketty's views, I mean, France is a very state-controlled economy where the role of the state and the size of the state is the highest in Europe, more or less, and has been so for a very substantial period of time. And when I started working in the former Eastern European countries, I've written a book called Women versus Capitalism. So I absolutely had to look at what other economic environments sort of do for women. I was very much involved in doing privatization work. Jeffrey Sachs was there, and we talked about how we were in the similar meetings with all his sort of young economists there at the time. It was quite revolutionary, of course, but it was notable how many women we found in senior positions. Not that the women, of course, in former Soviet Union or in communist environments had an easy time, as they still did all the work in terms of queuing and fetching and carrying and so on. But at the risk of oversimplifying a little bit what was going on at the time, the focus on family and individualism was discouraged for most of the time. So when we're thinking about socialism, how it would work, and this is an interesting aspect of it. So men and women form part of the same labor force, so they're encouraged to apply for the same jobs, more or less. And that was, of course, helped by free childcare that was given at the time. And people worked very close and lived very close to their work. There were health facilities that were provided there as well, housing as well. So it was quite a different sort of environment. But what it really meant is that women were working alongside the men, and equality was considerably stronger. Much of that has, including, unfortunately, good health provision, disappeared with the onset of capitalism in Eastern Europe, and women's economic empowerment retreated as a result. And it's only now, if you look at the statistics, that it's beginning to improve again. So what is happening? So if you look at the capitalist state, then the answer must be that the system just cannot allocate resources in the most efficient way. It is interesting, again, listening to, it was possible, I can't remember whether it was Thomas Piketty or someone else who said it, that there must be a way in which we can get that inequality to be reduced without harming productivity. But it's the other way around. It is that productivity will be improved if we reduce inequality. And that is at the essence of what we should be pushing for. It's interesting, really, when you look at women in particular and the inequality that still is there. The historian Mary Baird, in her book Women versus Power, Women and Power, examined how culturally embedded, really, women's exclusion from power has been through the ages. And power, of course, is not just political, but also economic. Or rather, the one feeds off the other. If women were more economically empowered, then they would also be more influential in politics, and vice versa. But of course, capitalism is clearly preferable to most of us to say the regime that exists in North Korea. North Korea has been very much in the news now because of the visit of their leader to meet Putin. But it claims it has achieved sexual equality. But Human Rights Watch earlier this year reported that women and girls are subject to intense and pervasive human rights abuses there, including sexual and gender-based violence, widespread discrimination, and enforcement of rigid gender stereotypes. But we don't really have to just go as far as North Korea for that. We know what's going on in Afghanistan right now, where there's not even a pretension any longer of equal rights for women, and women in Iran, of course, as we know, are struggling to be heard at present. But the worry is that even in freer societies, this power imbalance remains evident. A report in the UK, for example, just last week highlighted the sexual harassment faced by female surgeons at the NHS. And in business, what we've seen, at least we're beginning to see tighter rules being applied to deal with male bosses' inappropriate behaviors. But in business, women still remain as bosses in a minority. Admittedly, it doesn't always go very well when they are running companies, but the same can be said for men. What we've seen in the UK is that after Alison Rose's recent demise as CEO of NatWest Bank, it leaves, once again, just 9 women CEOs in the UK FTSE 100, and only 16% of the bosses of the European stocks 600 listed companies are women. And across the world, women CEOs make up just 3.6% of the total. You would have imagined that by now, after all the period of capitalism we've been hearing about earlier today, that would have changed. Yes, there was a suggestion that perhaps venture capital is not what it's claimed to be in terms of pushing productivity and innovation, but nevertheless, funding for women entrepreneurs, for what it's worth, is only a fraction of that for men. And in fact, the list of the 10 richest people, I was really quite interested to hear earlier presentations, in the world contains no women at all. It is all men, and for some reason, 9 of them reside in the US. Perhaps you can explain that. But it's still the case that among the richest women, if we look at them, because there is a list of them, they have either inherited their wealth. We heard a bit about inherited wealth and how it should be treated by Thomas Piketty earlier. They either acquired it from their husbands, especially after a successful divorce, usually run in London, were part of a successful husband-wife business partnership, or benefited from being part of what was effectively a family business dynasty, which is really what's happening with Arnaud and France. But not that wealth, of course, should be the only indicator. There are other inequities in capitalism. Again, we've been hearing a bit about that, apart from gender inequities, not least indeed, as Thomas Piketty was showing, inherited wealth, inherited poverty, and who your parents are, basically. And that affects men and women, of course. But we also know that capitalism, with its inherent lack of competition, and again, when you look at some of those very, very big firms right now, particularly in the tech sector, you begin to wonder how they have become so large, have been allowed to become so large. Well, what it does create, this lack of competition, is rents for some that are allowed to persist until the government intervenes. So this discussion that, again, we touched on earlier about perhaps some of the big firms being broken up in the future, it comes to mind right now. But we can look at persistent, whatever happens in the other area, wage and wealth gender differences that exist, the so-called gender gap, as a form of rent. A bit like when you look at the overall lack of competition and the rents that are acquired by various people in the population. Or if you like, a sort of windfall gain for being a man. And so the power imbalance mentioned by Mary Beard permeates society as a result, even in our modest field of economics, where people rarely become super rich. The picture doesn't look particularly good. So analysis by Vox in 2021 showed that only 5% of women were listed among the top-ranked economic authors in the world. Only 21% of the top think tanks had women at the helm, and their representatives at top university economic departments was also only 20%. Even in the private sector, the share of women as chief economists in the largest private companies by revenue of the Fortune 500 was 22%, but much worse in finance, where in banks it was just 9%. Admittedly, one of the very good things is that for a little while, the share of women chief economists at the World Bank, the OECD, and the IMF was 100%. It's no longer the case, but that was brilliant, something to seriously celebrate. And in the IMF right now, the numbers 1 and 2 jobs are currently held by women. Again, something really, really good in terms of progress. Now, of course, the governor of the Central Bank of Russia is a woman, which is interesting in itself. She's been at the job for about a decade. There's now also a woman central bank governor in Turkey, who seems to have improved the situation quite significantly, which is rather brilliant. And although there's never been a woman Chancellor of the Exchequer, in other words, Finance Minister, in the UK, that might change come the next election if Labour wins, because there is somebody waiting to take that role. But if you look, nevertheless, the female share of central bank governors worldwide was just 8%, and that of finance ministers, a miserable 11%. So we haven't really progressed very much. But yes, of course, there have been women at the top. But these pioneers are exceptions to the rule. Among the heads of state, we're going to hear a little bit about Italy later. There is a female prime minister in the shape of Meloni in Italy, the first female prime minister that they've had. And there's also a female prime minister in France, but it doesn't matter very much because the head of state is Macron, a man. At least Christine Lagarde, who was, of course, at the IMF. We now have a first woman head of the European Central Bank. Of course, the US had got there earlier with Janet Yellen. And Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, is also the first woman to have this role, although, admittedly, she only got it as a second choice because there were factions fighting for their own men, and in the end, the Hand of Solomon somehow or other decided that it should be a woman, and there it was. But with the change at the top, you would have thought that there would also be lots of changes further down. Well, it hasn't happened. So if you look at the picture, congratulatory picture, every time they raise interest rates, which they have done a number of times recently, the latest one, you see the whole 26-member governing council, not governing council, the of the ECB, which has 26 members, as I said, of which there's only Christine Lagarde and Isabel Schnabel, who is an ex-academic, who are the women there. They form part of what is called the executive committee of 6 people. The chief economist is an ex-Irish central banker. And then you have the 20 central bank governors of the Eurozone. Well, I don't have to ask you to give me the answer, but it is obvious. They're all men, not a single woman central governor in the Eurozone, which is absolutely extraordinary. But at least in politics, the EU is slightly better than other bastions of patriarchy. The European Parliament boasts some 40% women. In Japan, it's just 16%. So we have a long way to go. And yet, just mentioning this, to get back to the economics, it's often dismissed as positioning women as victims and therefore doing them a disservice. And pro-free marketeers often say that it must just be supply and demand operating as it should. And so just represents the efficient functioning of market forces to reflect women's choices. Whether the flaw in this argument is that much of the experience of women in societies and the structure that will provide greater equality is simply not reflected in markets. A lot of what women do on the roles is non-commodified, non-monetized, but nevertheless very important activities, and many of those lie outside markets and not counted in GDP. And therefore, they do not exercise any pressure for change through market signals. And yet, when you look at what's been happening historically, market forces did not by themselves eliminate child labor and exploitation. And what is more, there is a form of forced labor that still exists, as is still the case that girls and women do most of the unpaid work, as I hinted, that is done worldwide, which Oxfam calculates equivalent to some $10 trillion. So why aren't women in their right positions and able to exercise power, if you like, economic power particularly? But there is no evidence that women are less ambitious or are less productive than men when given the chance and the tools to perform. Indeed, when we experimented in the UK with providing enterprise sessions in schools, what we found was that boys were twice as willing to then start their own business. Girls were 4 times as willing to start their own business. That suggests that there had been a lack of information of what they could do when they grew up. So without that information, guidance, networking, and sufficient number of visible role models, girls seem to be pushed by the system, career advisory services everywhere, to lower value jobs and are expected to do a lot of extra work behind. And that, of course, is a clear information asymmetry, a clear market failure, which absolutely requires state intervention. And choice is not really something that women can have. Choice is a luxury. It's not available unless one lives and operates in an environment devoid of social and regulatory imposed norms. And average chances, life chances, depend on conditional probability, as we know, and choice is imperceptibly, often very perceptibly, in fact, constrained. Take motherhood. We're going to hear a little bit more about that, I think, later. Exercising your choice is also mentioned regularly in relation to women having babies, though, of course, it takes 2 to tango, as they say. But this has been belatedly recognized in EU changes to paternity leave. And it's quite interesting because in a survey tracking HR interviews in the UK, just before the pandemic, 30% of those asking the questions inquire of women what plans they have for looking after their children, even though it is illegal to do so. Men are not asked that question. And one cannot really ignore the evidence that if you have a child, first 12 years, your income, the gap increases very significantly. That's called the motherhood penalty. Again, we'll hear a little bit more about that later. That penalty seems to be worse for some reason in German-speaking countries. It seems to be best in Scandinavia, which again will not surprise you, and it's middle, but pretty bad, in English-speaking countries, like the UK and the US. I wonder how one can do a correlation between language and women's position in the workplace. Interestingly enough, after the first child, fathers' pay increases. So it's one of the reasons for the gap. And some interesting study has also been done on mobility. That, of course, is changing now with work from home, which is actually a big positive for women. What they found is that traditionally, after the birth of the first child, the distance of commuting of the men increased, and that of the women decreased as they were trying to find jobs around them. to help with the children. And actually, it increases almost exactly the same as the wage gap growth after the birth of the first child. So men try and get better income as a result of having the first child, and women are constrained as a result. So historical analysis also shows that it was economies and regions where women's later marriageable age was raised that did best in the past. That's because they stayed slightly longer in education. There was huge impact on their children, and it was those countries that industrialized a lot better than others. And analysis done by Costas Meguiar et al. In the US shows the substantial intergenerational returns. Since we're talking about capitalism and society, of a mother's education. So the more years on average a mother had been educated, the greater up to a certain age a child would benefit in terms of levels of achievement. And that, of course, then flowed through to the economy as a whole. So we all lose out when women's economic emancipation does not reach the optimum level. And even within markets, there is mounting evidence that diversity across an organization tends to be good for business outcomes. And in standard economics, we call that rationality failure, basically, which again requires a little bit of action. And that is because you fail to take advantage of what is an obvious benefit to the firm and to society. But sadly, because of the way the capitalist system works, it requires long-term commitment, investment to get there, and not relying too much on short-term profits. So the negative externalities, my argument to all this, so to explain why I'm talking about market failure and so on, is that the only way to get that equality is not through letting the system work, or perhaps some of Thomas Piketty's ideas might get us there, but it requires market intervention. In fact, any improvement we've seen in women's position, or most of it has been due to legislation changing and pushing for women to be treated differently in the workplace. But of course, people on the right claim that market failures don't exist except precisely when the government intervenes and distorts the market. It's government failures, in other words, that we know all about. And there is also the opposite view, which is from some center-left economists, like Mariana Mazzucato, for example, who believe that we concentrate too much on teaching civil servants about market failures. I was a civil servant, and I did focus on market failure, so I fall under that problem. There's no doubt about that. Because there is so much more the state can do to shape markets. So you don't just intervene when there is a market failure, you do it from the beginning. That's, I think, the Thomas Piketty idea as well. But we are where we are. There are market failures, and these market failures need to be addressed. But finally, really, who decides policy matters too. I mean, a lot of those improvements in women's positions at work have come from women being in power and deciding to change the legislation. Certainly that was the case in the UK. So who makes the decisions matters, and not just in terms of the public sector, but also what happens in the private sector. What we find is that in business, it matters because both men and women tend to be, that's what evidence suggests, inclined to hire people after their own image. There was all this talk about queen bees, that women would not be interested in hiring other women because they don't want their own position to be in any way affected, because they made it. Why should they help anyone else? But actually the evidence suggests that there are queen bees, but they are very, very small in numbers, and they do tend to hire more like them. But of course, as I said earlier, the number of women at the top of organizations is still very, very small, and that is a serious problem. So just then to remind you of where we still are in terms of the pay gap. So the pay gap that should have been competed away doesn't get competed away because of all the restrictions that still exist, whether it is through conscious and unconscious bias, restrictions in the jobs that perhaps women can do, to inadequate information. So what we have is the full-time hourly gap is still some 11.9% on average across the OECD on the basis of full-time hourly rates, having come down to just 2 points since 2010. It's 18% in the US, 12.7% in the EU, and that is despite the fact that girls in many Western capitalist countries consistently outperform their male counterparts in schools and in entering universities at the same or even in larger numbers. And one of the interesting things that the Pew research suggesting is that perhaps we've reached the point where extra university education may not give you an awful lot more, so they may not be getting this extra benefit of of getting that higher education. But it still doesn't explain the fact that, as evidence from France seems to suggest, the gap is bigger the more educated men and women are. So the only explanation then can be that there are still too many market failures that keep the gap alive, from information asymmetries, as I mentioned, to failure to value caring, the networking, which women don't do very much. And there was a very interesting article in the Financial Times just the other day, which showed that what has happened because of work from home and flexibility is that the golf courses are considerably fuller at particular times of the week. Well, what it didn't say is that the majority of the people playing that golf are men, whereas the women are still doing other things when they're not, in fact, working. So that remains really a differentiating factor. There is inadequate childcare support. That is among the lowest in the UK and the US, among the OECD. And there are behavioral factors. Implicit bias, for example, which of course have been emphasized by economists such as Iris Bonet. So, the final thing to say about bias and sexism, perhaps, if you like. A survey by the Office for National Statistics in the UK found that using a blinder Oaxaca, forgive me for mispronouncing that, decomposition, only 36% of the pay gap between full-time hourly rates for men and women could be explained by identifiable factors such as age, occupation, length of holding posts, and so on. The rest, 64%, was probably bias. Well, that needs to change. And I will stop here and perhaps take the odd question, if there is any time, unless I've overrun like mad. We've got time for a question or two. Thank you. I did say everyone was going to be quite, oh good, there's a question there. Hi.
Thank you. I was a little surprised. You talked about the fact that a lot of non-market factors were not measured. But they are being measured, and there is a lot of work that suggests, and the family plays a very integral role in this economy. I don't know whether you call it a capitalist institution or not. I think it's the most basic institution in human life. But recently, with work looking at sharing rules and looking at the way that women benefit from marriage and the way that more educated women are getting larger shares, attracting more mates that are more educated like they are, that if you start measuring welfare in this way and looking at the output of children, you mentioned McGeer, but there are others, Chiapperi and many others working on this question. So what I worry about is this notion is only market driven. I mean, you sort of ask what's welfare driven? You sort of ask just think about Jeremy Bentham, the greatest good. It's not just the way we measure GDP. Kuznets, 90 years ago said we couldn't really measure it very carefully. And we can't because of these non-market factors. But when we count those, there's substantial benefit. And women are getting a larger and larger share of that. So what I'm worried about is you're taking everything in terms of market terms, and why not the larger term about welfare and what the opportunities are for men and women?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think what I was saying is that the market forces don't quite get you there, so there are also...
Judging failure and success by percentage of people's salaries. You're not counting the full surplus that accrues. Mothers benefit from the child, the surplus that comes in marriage, the extra gains, and so forth and so on, the extra bargaining power that comes from enhanced women's education. And so the whole discussion just leaves the family out, and it leaves non-market output out, and that's central to the functioning of a society. Forget about capitalism. Let's talk about a larger society.
Okay, so what I agree with you entirely is about the family being really important. I have 5 children of my own. I know exactly what you mean. But I also mentioned the estimate of what the work done outside the market system adds up to in terms of global GDP, which is very important. It's not measured. And there's all that about measuring GDP better, which is absolutely right. And that needs to be done. The only problem is that that society doesn't necessarily value that. And because it's not monetized, so if you're doing some work at home, it's not calculated as part of GDP, and you lose some of your bargaining power. where it's true that women are better educated, as you were saying, and it is true that they pass a lot of it on to their children, and that is one of the reasons why, various countries where women are well educated also have a societal benefit, because it sort of permeates through. It's intergenerational positiveness that comes out of it. My general argument is that market forces alone will not do it, and we need to take into account all these other issues and push for a lot of that to be recognized. So my view is also, somebody mentioned earlier in an earlier talk about giving graduates a certain amount of money at the end of their study so they can do something with it. I'm also, which are the bits that I did not read, I'm also in favor of possibly universal basic income so that it values, if you like, what women do. But the whole point of this is that society wins if women can make a choice and then do quite a lot in terms of the contribution to society in a way that is properly understood, partly remunerated, but also sort of treasured so they can have an influence on how things go. Because if you're outside the normal monetized society, your influence is a lot smaller. That's basically.
It's a very limited perspective on what the full compensation is, what the full benefits are. And if there's choice out there, I don't know, it doesn't have to be capitalism. I'm not talking about capitalism. We're talking about choice and letting people, there's a lot of choice that people seem to think are benefiting from this. And the question really becomes whether you think these people are being coerced into these roles, or whether you think these people are choosing.
Indeed, what I said is that there are people that you may think is choice, but it isn't always choice. It may be just the only thing that you can do, given everything has happened around you, because you don't have the right information to make a slightly different choice than you would have done if you did have that information. So I'm saying that there is a definite market failure in terms of information asymmetry that's out there, which is what needs to be plugged in to ensure that the choice is the real choice. So my point was that that's what people are saying. It's a choice, and it should be valued as a choice. But if that choice is made on limited knowledge of what your choices are, then it's not a real choice. It is more coercion.